April 19th, 1945. The small Bavarian village of Kronach sat nestled in rolling hills, barely 50 kilometers from the Czechoslovakian border, its cobblestone streets empty except for the distant rumble of artillery that had been growing louder each day. The ancient village, with its medieval architecture and narrow winding lanes, had witnessed centuries of European conflict stretching back to the 30 Years' War, but never had its inhabitants felt such profound dread as in these final weeks. The stone buildings that had stood for hundreds of years seemed to hold their breath, waiting for whatever catastrophe was approaching. Inside the stone walls of St. Catherine's Convent, perched on a hillside overlooking the village, Mother Superior Hildegard knelt in the chapel, rosary beads trembling between her fingers, as she prayed for deliverance from what she had been told would be the greatest horror of all. The chapel was dim in the early morning light, illuminated only by 2 candles flickering before the altar, their small flames casting dancing shadows across the wooden pews and stone walls. The air smelled of incense and old stone and beeswax, familiar scents that had always brought Mother Hildegard comfort and peace during her decades of religious life, but now seemed powerless against the overwhelming fear that gripped her heart. She could hear the other sisters moving about in the corridors beyond the heavy wooden door, speaking in hushed, trembling whispers, their anxiety and terror palpable even through the barrier of thick oak and iron hinges. The sisters had heard the stories, whispered with rising panic by fleeing soldiers and terrified civilians who had passed through Kronach in recent days, about the advancing enemy forces, and particularly about certain units that German propaganda for years had portrayed as savage, uncivilized, and dangerous. Every refugee who had stopped in the village, every retreating soldier, every government official fleeing eastward had added to these tales, building a picture so terrifying that the sisters could barely sleep at night, startling awake at every sound, every distant explosion, every rumble of engines on the roads below. They believed with absolute and paralyzing certainty that their darkest hour was approaching, with the inevitability of a storm rolling across the Bavarian hills. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Mother Hildegard and her 23 sisters could not imagine, as they barricaded the heavy oak doors with furniture and shuttered every window with trembling hands, as they gathered the elderly and children into the most protected inner rooms, as they prayed with desperate fervor for divine intervention, was that within 48 hours, their entire understanding of humanity, war, and faith would be transformed by the very men they feared most. This is the story of how terror became grace, how prejudice met dignity face to face, how deeply ingrained hatred confronted complicated human goodness, and how a moment of unexpected prayer in a small German convent revealed truths that no propaganda machine, no matter how sophisticated or relentless, could permanently obscure. The convent of St. Catherine had stood on its hillside location overlooking the valley for nearly 400 years. Its foundation stones laid in 1547 during a period of relative peace between the religious conflicts that would later tear Europe apart. Its thick stone walls, built to last centuries, enclosed a courtyard garden where the sisters grew vegetables and herbs, carefully tending rows of cabbage and potatoes, beans and carrots, medicinal plants that they used to treat illnesses in the local community. There was a small chapel with stained glass windows depicting the life of their patron saint, Catherine of Alexandria, the colored glass casting jewel-toned light across the altar when the sun shone through. The living quarters were simple but comfortable, designed for a life of prayer, work, and service to God and community. Currently, those living quarters sheltered not only the 24 nuns, but also 8 elderly villagers who had no family to care for them, and 3 children whose parents had disappeared weeks earlier in the chaos of the collapsing front lines, swallowed up by the confusion and displacement that characterized the war's final months. Mother Hildegard was 57 years old, a woman whose face showed both the serenity of decades spent in prayer and the worry lines of recent months. She had entered religious life at 18, drawn by a deep sense of vocation and a desire to serve God through a life of contemplation and community service. She had never imagined, during those early years of youthful idealism and spiritual fervor, that her vocation would be tested in such extreme circumstances. She had been appointed Mother Superior 11 years earlier, in 1934, a time when the world seemed to be finding its footing after the economic catastrophes of the previous decade. She had carefully navigated the increasingly difficult years that followed, protecting her community while trying to avoid political entanglements as much as possible. The convent had always been a place of quiet refuge, a peaceful sanctuary where the hours were marked by bells calling the sisters to prayer, where the seasons turned with planting and harvest, where the rhythms of religious life provided structure and meaning. It was a life of routine prayer and simple work, growing food in their gardens, preserving vegetables for winter, teaching local children their letters and numbers in a small schoolroom off the courtyard, caring for the sick and elderly, maintaining the ancient buildings and their traditions. But now, in the spring of 1945, all routine had shattered completely, irreparably broken by the approaching thunder of war. The radio broadcasts they occasionally heard when batteries could be spared spoke in increasingly frantic tones of enemy forces advancing from multiple directions, closing in on what remained of territory still held by German military control. The confident announcements of earlier years, promising certain victory and eternal supremacy, had given way to desperate exhortations and thinly veiled acknowledgments of catastrophe. The few remaining German military units in the area were in full retreat, disorganized and demoralized, many of them consisting of boys barely old enough to shave and old men who should have been grandfathers. Civilians were fleeing eastward in an endless stream, pushing carts piled high with whatever possessions they could manage, carrying whatever they could carry, their faces etched with exhaustion and blank-eyed shock and terror of what might be pursuing them. The soldiers who passed through Kronach in those final weeks, many of them barely more than boys with oversized uniforms and haunted eyes, spoke in frightened whispers about the overwhelming power of the approaching forces, about the futility of resistance, about the certainty of defeat. Sister Agnes, who was 32 years old and served as the convent's liaison with the village below, her responsibility to maintain connections with the local community and coordinate any assistance they could provide, had heard specific warnings that filled her with a particular and focused dread. Local officials, including the mayor and the chief of the local constabulary, before they themselves fled the village in the dark of night, abandoning their posts and responsibilities, had told terrifying stories about certain enemy units, describing them in terms that drew upon every prejudice and fear that years of propaganda had systematically and deliberately cultivated in the German population. These stories specifically focused on African American soldiers serving in the advancing army, portraying them in the most dehumanizing and frightening terms possible, describing them as dangerous, violent, uncivilized, and barely human. The propaganda had been relentless and pervasive, seeping into even the most isolated communities, poisoning minds with fear and hatred. The officials had urged the sisters to flee immediately, to abandon the convent and seek safety further east, painting pictures of horrors that awaited if they remained. But Mother Hildegard had refused to leave. Where would they go? The roads were clogged with desperate refugees moving east toward an uncertain future. They had responsibilities to the elderly people in their care who could not walk far or quickly. They had 3 terrified children who needed stability and protection. The convent was their home, their sanctuary, the place where they had devoted their lives to serving God. Abandoning it felt like abandoning their faith itself. So instead, they prepared to defend themselves as best they could with the limited means available to them. On the evening of April 18th, as the sound of artillery grew impossibly close, each explosion making the window glass rattle and causing dust to drift down from the ancient ceiling beams, and the glow of fires could be seen on the horizon painting the night sky an ominous orange, Mother Hildegard made the decision that they would barricade the convent and wait out whatever was coming. The heavy wooden doors at the main entrance were locked and reinforced with every piece of furniture they could move. Heavy wooden chests and thick tables pushed against the oak, creating a barrier that they hoped might provide some protection, or at least delay whatever violence might be headed their way. Windows on the ground floor were shuttered and secured with internal bars. Upper floor windows were blocked with heavy fabric to prevent anyone from seeing inside. The sisters gathered every person sheltered in the convent, all 35 individuals including the nuns, the elderly villagers, and the 3 frightened children, into the central chapel, the most protected room in the entire building with its thick stone walls and limited access points and its position in the heart of the complex. Sister Margaret, who at 61 was the eldest of the community, her hair completely white beneath her wimple, and her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her mind still sharp and her faith unshakable, led the group in repeated prayers of the rosary, her voice steady and strong, despite the fear that pervaded the chapel like a physical presence. They prayed the sorrowful mysteries, contemplating Christ's suffering, finding in those ancient prayers some small comfort and connection to something larger than their immediate terror. Sister Therese, barely 25 and the youngest member of the community, who had entered the convent only 4 years earlier, filled with idealistic devotion and now found herself confronting realities she had never imagined, clutched a small crucifix her mother had given her when she left home and tried to comfort the 3 children, all under age 10, who could sense the terror in the adults around them and responded with wide-eyed silence or quiet crying. The children pressed close to Sister Therese, finding in her youth some small sense of safety, though she herself felt anything but safe. The elderly villagers sat in the pews in silence, too exhausted and frightened for words, their weathered faces showing resignation born of having survived too much hardship already in their long lives. Mother Hildegard had positioned herself near the chapel door, her back straight despite the fear that made her hands shake, determined that if the worst came to pass, she would face it first and somehow protect those behind her. She had no weapons, no real plan beyond prayer, and the desperate hope that religious sanctuary might still mean something in this collapsing world, that even in the midst of total war there might remain some respect for holy ground and consecrated women. But deep in her heart, influenced by all the propaganda she had absorbed over the years, often without even realizing it, she feared that hope was futile. Through the long night, the longest night of her life, they heard distant explosions that made the building shake, the rumble of vehicles moving along the roads below, occasional shouting in German as the last military stragglers passed through the village, probably deserters or the remnants of defeated units fleeing the advance. Twice during the night they heard gunfire, sharp cracks that made everyone in the chapel jump, and the children cry out in fear. No one slept. They prayed and waited and tried to prepare themselves mentally for whatever dawn might bring. Then, as dawn broke on April 19th, casting pale grey light across the Bavarian countryside, silence fell. It was an eerie, complete, suffocating silence that somehow felt more threatening than all the sounds of conflict had been. The absence of noise was so profound it seemed to press against the ears. The sisters waited, barely breathing, afraid to make any sound that might draw attention, as the pale light of morning filtered through the cracks in the shuttered windows and the gaps around the blocked doors. Every creak of the old building settling, every breath, every heartbeat, seemed impossibly loud in that silence. The first sound they heard was different from anything they had expected. It was the rumble of vehicles, but not the familiar sound of German military equipment that they had been hearing for years. These engines had a different pitch, deeper and more powerful, a mechanical roar that spoke of industrial might and resources that Germany no longer possessed. The vehicles stopped somewhere in the village square, perhaps 200 meters from the convent down the hillside. There were voices, speaking in a language the sisters did not understand. English they assumed, though few of them knew enough of the language to be certain. The voices gave orders with the crisp efficiency and professional discipline of a well-organized military unit, not the chaos and panic they had heard from German forces recently. Sister Agnes, whose small window overlooked the approach path to the convent, winding up through terraced gardens and old olive trees, carefully opened the wooden shutter just the smallest crack, just enough to see out, without being obviously visible from below. Her hands shook as she peered through the narrow gap, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. What she observed through that crack made her breath catch in her throat and her stomach clench with the very specific terror she had been taught to feel. Moving up the hillside path toward the convent were approximately 20 soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, olive drab rather than the grey-green of German uniforms, with equipment and weapons she did not recognize. They moved with professional caution and trained efficiency, weapons at the ready, checking corners and possible ambush points with the practiced awareness of combat veterans who had learned through hard experience to take nothing for granted. They communicated with hand signals and quiet words, advancing in a coordinated pattern that spoke of thorough training and unit cohesion. But what froze Sister Agnes with the specific terror she had been conditioned to feel, what made her blood turn to ice in her veins, was the fact that every soldier she could see through her narrow viewing crack was African American. She stumbled back from the window as if physically struck, her legs suddenly weak, and ran to Mother Hildegard, her words tumbling out in a frightened whisper that nonetheless carried through the silent chapel and reached every ear. "They're here," she gasped. "The ones we were warned about. They're coming up the path right now." The unit they had been most warned about by every official and every piece of propaganda, the soldiers described in the most terrifying and dehumanizing terms, portrayed as barely human and certainly dangerous, were approaching their door at this very moment. Every prejudice that had been carefully cultivated over years, every fear that had been systematically implanted, every dehumanizing story the sisters had absorbed often, without even realizing how it poisoned their thinking, seemed about to be confirmed. The propaganda had worked exactly as intended, creating terror where there should have been only the normal anxiety of enemy soldiers approaching. Mother Hildegard felt her heart hammering in her chest so hard she thought it might burst, felt her hands go cold and numb, felt her breath coming in short gasps that she tried to control, but she forced herself to maintain outward calm, knowing that the others were looking to her for leadership and strength. She could not let them see her complete terror. She gathered the sisters and refugees behind her with a gesture, placed herself directly in front of the barricaded chapel door, and began to pray aloud in a voice that shook but remained audible, determined. If these were to be her final moments on earth, if this was how God had chosen her time to end, she would face it with faith and dignity. She prayed the Our Father, the most fundamental Christian prayer, the words her lips had spoken tens of thousands of times, but which now carried desperate urgency. The footsteps reached the convent's outer door, heavy boots on stone that grew louder with each step. There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever, a moment of suspension before everything changed. Then a firm knock, 3 solid raps against the wooden door. A voice called out in English, words the sisters could not understand, but with a tone that seemed impossibly and contradictory to everything they expected, more inquiring than threatening. The voice sounded almost polite. That couldn't be right. There was another knock, louder this time, more insistent. When no response came because the sisters were too terrified to respond, frozen in fear, the soldiers could be heard testing the door, pushing against it and finding it solidly barricaded. What happened next would have been the moment for forced entry, for violence, for all the terrors that propaganda had promised would come. The sisters braced themselves for the crash of the door being broken down, for shouting and weapons and all the horrors they had been warned about. Instead, incredibly and completely unexpectedly, the sisters heard conversation in English just outside the door. The voices sounded almost confused, perhaps discussing among themselves why a convent would be so heavily barricaded and what that might mean. There was a longer pause, more conversation, what sounded like debate or discussion. Then, incredibly and almost impossibly to believe, the knocking came again, but this time accompanied by words in broken, heavily accented German. A voice, male and deep but somehow gentle, called out through the door. "Nonnen? Sisters? We are American soldiers. We will not hurt you. Please open door." The German was heavily accented and clearly unpracticed, the grammar imperfect, but it was understandable, and the effort to communicate in their language was itself startling. Mother Hildegard stood frozen, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. This was not what she had been told to expect. Where was the violence? Where was the savagery? The voice continued after a pause. "We see this is Church Place. We respect Church Place. We need to check building is safe, that no soldiers hide here. Then we leave you in peace. Please, we mean no harm." Sister Agnes whispered urgently that they should remain silent, that it must be some kind of deception or trick, that the moment they opened the door, the true horror would begin. Several other sisters nodded in frightened agreement, but something in the tone of that voice, something in the careful and respectful attempt to speak their language, and the explicit mention of respecting the church and holy ground made Mother Hildegard hesitate. She had expected shouting, demands, threats, violence. Instead, there was an almost formal politeness, a respectfulness that did not match anything she had been conditioned to expect from these particular soldiers. Her mind struggled with the disconnect between expectation and reality. She made a decision that would change everything that followed. One of those pivotal moments when a single choice alters the course of events. In a trembling voice that she fought to keep steady, she called out in German, "We have elderly people here and small children. Please, I beg you, do not hurt us. We are women of God who have harmed no one." There was an immediate response in English, a quick burst of words she didn't understand. Then the same gentle voice in broken German replied, "We will not hurt. This is promise before God. We are soldiers, yes, but we are also men of God, men of faith. Please open doors slowly. We will not hurt anyone." Men of God, men of faith. The phrases struck Mother Hildegard with unexpected force, like a bell ringing in a silent church. These were not the words she had been taught these particular soldiers would speak. These were not the sentiments that propaganda had said they were capable of expressing. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them, she nodded to Sister Agnes and Sister Margaret. Together, their movements slow and hesitant, they began to remove the furniture that barricaded the door. The other sisters watched in terrified silence, several clutching crucifixes, many with tears running down their faces, as the heavy oak door was slowly unbarred and the furniture pulled away. Mother Hildegard's hand on the door handle felt like ice. She pulled the door open slowly, inch by inch, afraid of what she would see but determined to face it with whatever courage she could muster. What Mother Hildegard saw when she opened that door was something her mind struggled to process because it contradicted every expectation, every assumption, every piece of propaganda that had been built up over years. Standing in the morning sunlight streaming down on the convent courtyard were 5 soldiers in American uniforms. They were indeed African American, but what struck her with almost physical force was not the color of their skin, but rather their expressions, their body language, their entire demeanor. Each man had lowered his weapon, holding it pointed at the ground in a non-threatening position. Their postures were alert and professional, but not aggressive or menacing. And the soldier in front, a sergeant whose name tape read Washington, held his helmet respectfully in his hands, had removed it in a gesture of respect that was absolutely unmistakable. Sergeant James Washington was 31 years old, originally from Atlanta, Georgia, a city he had left 6 years earlier. He had been in Europe since the previous summer, since July of 1944, serving with the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the few African-American armored units in the United States Army. His unit had fought through France, starting with the breakout from Normandy, had battled across Belgium in the bitter cold of winter, and had pushed into Germany in the spring, facing not only the enemy in front of them, but also the prejudice and discrimination embedded within their own military system. The American military was still segregated, treating African-American soldiers as inferior, denying them opportunities and recognition that white soldiers received automatically. He had seen more combat than most men could survive and remain sane, had lost friends and brothers in arms to artillery and machine guns and mines, had witnessed horrors that would stay with him for the rest of his life, and had every reason to be hardened and bitter about the world and his treatment within it. But James Washington had been raised in a deeply religious household by people who believed faith was not just something you professed on Sunday, but something you lived every day. His grandmother, who had essentially raised him after his mother died when he was 8 years old, had insisted that every Sunday begin with church services at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where 3 generations of the family had worshipped. His grandmother had taught him that faith meant treating all people with dignity, regardless of how they treated you, that maintaining your own humanity in the face of dehumanization was itself an act of resistance and faith. When he saw the barricaded convent and understood that terrified religious women were sheltering inside, understood their fear even if he found it painful that they had been taught to fear him specifically, his first instinct was not as a soldier or as someone who might be angry at being prejudged, but as the grandson of a woman who had served her own church community faithfully for 60 years. He looked at the elderly nun standing before him in the doorway, seeing the fear written plainly in her eyes, seeing how her hands shook and how she had positioned herself between his soldiers and the people she was trying to protect. And he also saw the courage it took for her to open that door despite her terror. He recognized bravery when he saw it, and he respected it. He spoke in his broken German, words he had practiced over the past months as they moved through German territory. "Mother Superior, we must check building for enemy soldiers who hide, but we will be respectful. This I promise before God and on my mother's grave." Mother Hildegard, confronting the vast and disorienting gap between her expectations and this reality standing before her, managed to nod, though her mind was reeling. She stepped back, her legs weak, allowing the soldiers to enter. Sergeant Washington gestured to his men with hand signals, and they moved into the convent with professional efficiency, but also with a visible carefulness that surprised and continued to surprise the sisters who watched them. They cleared rooms methodically and thoroughly, checking for hidden enemy soldiers or weapons caches or anything that might pose a military threat. But they touched nothing unnecessarily, disturbed nothing without reason, and treated the space with obvious and unmistakable respect. They moved quietly, spoke in low voices, and were clearly trying to be as non-threatening as possible given that they were armed soldiers searching a building. Private David Carter, 23 years old, from Chicago, found himself in the convent's small library, a room lined with wooden shelves holding books that had been collected and preserved over centuries. He had been a student at a Negro college before the war, hoping to become a teacher and spend his life educating young people, and the sight of the carefully preserved books, some of them clearly very old and valuable, made his heart ache with nostalgia for a life that seemed impossibly distant now. He ran his fingers gently along the spines, reading Latin titles he half remembered from his studies, seeing works of theology and history and literature. He touched nothing roughly, took nothing, and when Sister Therese peered fearfully around the corner, drawn by curiosity despite her fear, and saw him standing there among the books, he turned to her and smiled gently, a warm expression meant to reassure, and moved on to continue his search without disturbing anything in the room. Corporal Marcus Jenkins, 27 years old, from a small town in Louisiana, was checking the kitchen and storage areas when he noticed how depleted the food supplies were. Opening the pantry, he saw shelves that should have been full of preserved foods, but were nearly bare. A few jars of pickled vegetables, a small amount of flour, almost no protein. He saw the meager portions that had been set out for the morning meal on the worn kitchen table, barely enough to feed the number of people he knew were sheltering in this building, based on what he had seen. He made a mental note to mention this immediately to Sergeant Washington. These women and children and elderly people were nearly starving, and while he couldn't solve all the world's problems, he could certainly address this one immediate need. The search of the entire convent took perhaps 20 minutes, though to the sisters huddled in the chapel, it felt like hours. The soldiers found no hidden enemy troops, no weapons beyond kitchen knives used for cooking, nothing that posed any military threat whatsoever. When they regathered in the convent's small courtyard, with its vegetable garden and old stone well, Sergeant Washington reported to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Robert Morrison, who had remained outside with the rest of the unit maintaining a security perimeter. Lieutenant Morrison was 26 years old, originally from Detroit, Michigan. He had graduated from college in 1941 with a degree in engineering and been drafted into the Army the following year. Like all the men in his unit, he had faced the peculiar and painful challenge of fighting for a country that did not fully recognize his equality or humanity, fighting against an ideology of racial supremacy while being treated as racially inferior by his own military. The irony of liberating people who might fear or despise him because of his skin color was not lost on him, but he had learned to focus on the mission and on maintaining his dignity and professionalism, regardless of circumstances or provocations. When Sergeant Washington reported that the convent held only frightened religious women, elderly civilians, and young children, and that they appeared to be nearly out of food and in desperate need of basic supplies, Lieutenant Morrison made an immediate decision. His unit had ample rations, more than they needed immediately, and he had discretion to provide assistance to civilian populations. He ordered his men to bring rations from their supply trucks, Within minutes, soldiers were carrying boxes of American military rations into the convent, far more food than the inhabitants had seen in weeks or possibly months. Canned goods, chocolate bars, coffee, sugar, flour, dried beans, canned meat, powdered milk, an abundance that seemed almost obscene compared to the near-starvation conditions they had been enduring. Mother Hildegard watched in stunned silence that gradually gave way to tears as these men, whom she had been taught for years to fear as savage and uncivilized and dangerous, whom she had believed were incapable of kindness or mercy, carefully and respectfully stacked food supplies in the convent kitchen. The soldiers were gentle with the packages, organized in their placement, almost reverent in their handling of food they knew meant survival for hungry people. Sister Agnes found tears running down her face, unable to reconcile what she was witnessing with what she had believed, the cognitive dissonance almost painful. The elderly villagers stared in confusion and dawning shame as they realized how thoroughly they had been deceived, how completely propaganda had poisoned their minds and hearts. The three children watched with wide eyes, young enough that they might not yet have absorbed all the prejudices of the adults, but old enough to sense that something profound and unexpected was happening. But the moment that would forever remain etched in Mother Hildegard's memory with absolute clarity, the moment when her understanding of the world and of humanity and of her own faith fundamentally shifted, came shortly after the food had been delivered and stacked and the soldiers were preparing to leave, to continue their sweep through the village and surrounding area. The soldiers were checking their equipment, preparing to move out, when Sergeant Washington paused at the chapel door. He looked inside at the simple altar with its white cloth, the wooden crucifix hanging above it, the worn pews where generations of sisters had prayed, the stained glass windows depicting the life of St. Catherine. Something in his expression changed, softened. He stood there for a long moment, just looking, and Mother Hildegard saw something in his face that looked like longing or homesickness or recognition. He turned to Mother Hildegard and said in his broken German, speaking slowly so she would understand, "May we pray? Just one moment. We like to thank God for safety, for bringing us through battle to this place." Mother Hildegard, too shocked to speak, her mind unable to fully process what was being asked, simply nodded. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each moment distinct and separate, burned into memory with perfect clarity. Sergeant Washington entered the chapel, his boots making soft sounds on the stone floor, and one by one, without being ordered or directed, the soldiers of his squad followed him. These combat veterans, these men who had fought their way across an ocean and across a continent, who had faced artillery and machine gun fire and mines and all the indescribable horrors of modern mechanized war, who had been treated as second-class citizens in their own military and told they were inferior by their own country, quietly and reverently removed their helmets and knelt in prayer before the altar of a German convent. The image burned itself into the consciousness of every person in that convent who witnessed it, an image that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The morning sun, streaming through the stained glass windows, cast colors across the soldiers' bowed heads, blues and reds and golds from the medieval glass. Some prayed silently, their lips moving without sound, lost in private communion with God. Private Carter had his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes closed, his expression peaceful. Corporal Jenkins had pulled from his pocket a small worn Bible, its cover soft with handling, and had it open on the pew in front of him, though he wasn't reading it, just holding it like a physical connection to faith. Sergeant Washington knelt in the front pew closest to the altar, his helmet on the floor beside him, his prayer audible enough that Mother Hildegard, standing frozen in the doorway, could hear him giving thanks for their safety and the safety of his men, asking blessings for the people they were liberating, praying for an end to the conflict and for peace. Sister Margaret, who had lived through 2 wars and the chaos between them, who thought she had seen everything humanity had to offer, both good and terrible, felt something break open inside her chest. All the propaganda, all the carefully constructed lies about who was human and who was not, who deserved dignity and who did not, who was capable of faith and who was not, crumbled and turned to dust in the face of this simple, profound act. These men prayed the same prayers she prayed. They sought the same God she sought. They carried the same humanity she carried, the same capacity for faith and kindness and nobility that she had been taught they lacked. The lie had been exposed completely by simple human truth. The prayer lasted perhaps 3 or 4 minutes, though time seemed suspended. When the soldiers rose and turned to leave, several of the sisters were openly weeping, tears streaming down their faces without shame or restraint. Mother Hildegard found her voice, though it was thick with emotion, and said in German, knowing Sergeant Washington would understand at least the intent and feeling, if not every word, "Thank you. Thank you for your mercy and your kindness. May God protect you and bring you safely home. May He bless you for what you have done here today." Sergeant Washington smiled, a warm and genuine expression that transformed his face and made him look younger, less worn by war. "God protects us all, Mother," he replied in English, and though she did not understand the exact words, she understood the meaning and the sentiment perfectly, because it was universal. As the soldiers filed out of the chapel and through the courtyard toward the door, Private Carter paused next to Sister Therese, who still held the 3 frightened children close, one small girl clutching her habit. He reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar, standard issue in American rations but precious as gold, and handed it to her specifically for the children. His gesture was gentle, his smile meant to reassure and comfort, and Sister Therese accepted it with trembling hands and a whispered thank you in German that needed no translation, because gratitude sounds the same in any language. Lieutenant Morrison, observing all of this from the courtyard where he had been coordinating security, made another command decision. His unit had been ordered to continue moving through the region, clearing and securing territory. But he recognized that this convent would need protection in the immediate future. Retreating German military forces were increasingly desperate and unpredictable, capable of anything in their fear and anger. The civilian population was vulnerable to random violence from defeated soldiers or from criminal elements taking advantage of the chaos. He designated 2 soldiers to remain stationed at the convent for the next 72 hours, ensuring the safety of its inhabitants until more permanent security arrangements could be made and military government could be established. The 2 soldiers selected for this duty were Corporal Marcus Jenkins and Private Thomas Wheeler, a quiet 24-year-old from rural Pennsylvania. For the next 3 days, these 2 men became the unlikely guardians of St. Catherine's Convent, a duty they approached with seriousness and visible respect for the importance of what they were doing. Those 3 days became an intensive education in humanity for both the soldiers and the sisters, a compressed experience of learning to see each other as fully human. Corporal Jenkins, it turned out, had grown up in a Baptist church in Louisiana, where his father had been a deacon and his mother had led the choir. He and the sisters discovered they shared many of the same hymns and spiritual songs, though sung to different melodies and in different languages, adapted to different traditions. On the second evening, as they sat in the courtyard garden while the sun set over the Bavarian hills, he quietly sang a spiritual his grandmother had taught him when he was a child. "Swing low, sweet chariot," his rich baritone voice filling the courtyard with its melody. The sisters listened in wonder, not understanding the English words, but understanding perfectly the emotion and faith expressed in the music. Music and prayer, they discovered, transcended language barriers. Private Wheeler was more reserved and less talkative than Corporal Jenkins, more comfortable with practical action than with words, but he had a skill that proved invaluable. He had grown up on a farm in Pennsylvania and noticed immediately that the convent's vegetable garden, which should have been productive in late spring, had been badly neglected in recent weeks, as the sisters had been too frightened to work outside, where they would be visible and vulnerable. He spent hours over those 3 days, helping Sister Agnes and Sister Therese repair the garden beds, replace damaged plants and plant seeds for late-season vegetables. The American supply trucks had included seeds as part of their assistance packages, practical items meant to help communities recover. He worked with patient efficiency, his movements showing deep familiarity with growing things, answering their questions about planting depth and spacing through gestures and simple words when language failed. The physical work of gardening became a form of communication and connection that needed few words. The 3 children, who had been absolutely terrified when the soldiers first arrived, peering out from behind Sister Therese's skirts, with wide, frightened eyes, within a day were following Corporal Jenkins around the courtyard, fascinated by his stories and his kindness and his patience with their questions, even though they couldn't understand most of his words. He taught them a simple hand-clapping game from his own childhood, a rhythmic pattern accompanied by a nonsense rhyme, and their laughter as they played it was the first genuinely joyful sound the convent had heard in months. The sound of children laughing seemed to lift some of the oppressive weight of fear that had hung over the place. Mother Hildegard spent long hours during those 3 days in contemplation and prayer, sitting in the chapel where the soldiers had knelt, wrestling with the profound cognitive dissonance between what she had been taught to believe for years and what she was directly experiencing. She had considered herself a faithful person, someone who genuinely tried to see God in all people, who believed in the fundamental teachings of Christianity about human dignity and worth. But she realized now with painful clarity how deeply the prejudices of her society had infected even her religious life, how thoroughly propaganda had poisoned even her faith. She had accepted, without sufficient question or examination, propaganda that systematically dehumanized these men. She had been prepared to believe the worst of them, based solely on the color of their skin, accepting lies that directly contradicted everything her faith taught about human equality before God. The shame of this realization was crushing and painful, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and her society. But it also brought a strange and unexpected kind of liberation, a freeing from illusions. If she had been so thoroughly deceived about this fundamental issue, what else had she been deceived about? What other lies had she accepted without sufficient examination? What other prejudices had she harbored without recognizing them as contradictions to her faith? The collapse of her prejudice opened a door to a more honest and authentic faith, one that did not allow for the convenience of considering some humans less worthy than others, one that took seriously the radical implications of believing all people were created in the image of God. On the evening of the 3rd day, Lieutenant Morrison returned with his unit. The tactical situation in the region had stabilized enough, the last scattered German military units having been captured or pushed beyond the area, that Corporal Jenkins and Private Wheeler could rejoin their squad. The moment of parting was emotional in ways that would have seemed absolutely impossible just 72 hours earlier, a depth of feeling that demonstrated how quickly genuine human connection could be formed when people met as humans rather than as categories. Mother Hildegard embraced Corporal Jenkins as a mother might embrace a beloved son, tears streaming down her face without embarrassment, not caring how it might look or what anyone might think. She pressed into his hands a small medal of St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers and those on journeys, that she had carried since her own youth when she first left home to enter the convent. "For your protection," she said in German, pressing it into his palm and closing his fingers around it. "May God watch over you always." Though he did not fully understand all her words, he understood the gesture perfectly. He carefully pinned the medal inside his uniform next to his heart, where he would carry it through the rest of the war and for the rest of his life. Sister Agnes gave Private Wheeler a small packet of seeds from their best garden varieties, carefully saved seeds that they had been cultivating and improving for years. "For when you go home," she said in broken English. She had been practicing privately over the 3 days, determined to be able to communicate directly. "For your family garden, so you remember us." He accepted them with quiet gratitude, carefully placing them in his pack where they would be safe, his eyes suspiciously bright with suppressed emotion. The 3 children cried openly, clinging to Corporal Jenkins's legs and not wanting to let him go, until Sister Therese gently pulled them away, with whispered promises that they would pray for him every day. Even the elderly villagers, who had been most thoroughly frightened initially, and who carried decades of accumulated prejudice, shook hands with the soldiers and offered blessings in German for their safety and their journey home. As the American unit prepared to move out, engines starting and soldiers mounting their vehicles, Sergeant Washington approached Mother Hildegard one final time. Through a combination of his broken German hand gestures and the kind of shared understanding that transcends language, he told her, "You show us great kindness, great courage to open door when you were afraid. We do not forget such things. War is terrible thing, brings out worst in people sometimes, But people can also choose to be good, choose to see other people as human. You choose good. We choose good. This is what God wants from us, I think. Mother Hildegard nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, tears blurring her vision. She watched from the convent courtyard as the soldiers mounted their vehicles and drove away down the hillside path, back toward the village and then beyond, back into the uncertainties of war and whatever battles still awaited them in the final weeks of the conflict. She did not know if she would ever see any of them again, if they would survive the fighting that continued in other parts of Germany, if they would make it home safely to their families and the lives they had left behind. But what she did know, with absolute unshakable certainty, was that her life and her faith had been fundamentally and permanently changed. The walls she had allowed to be built in her heart, the prejudices she had absorbed from her culture and time without sufficiently questioning them, had been demolished by the simple humanity and genuine faith of men she had been taught to fear. She had looked into the face of the other and seen herself reflected back. She had witnessed faith that put her own to shame. She had received kindness from those she had been told were incapable of kindness. In the weeks that followed, as Germany surrendered unconditionally and the war finally ended, and the long, difficult process of peace began, Mother Hildegard became something unexpected and powerful, a voice of reconciliation and witness to truth. When other villagers spoke fearfully or bitterly about the occupying forces, repeating old propaganda and old hatreds, she told them firmly and repeatedly about Sergeant Washington and his men, about their kindness and their faith and their humanity. When she heard people repeating the old lies, the old dehumanizing narratives, she confronted them directly with her testimony, refusing to allow propaganda to go unchallenged in her presence. Sister Agnes and Sister Therese both said later that they had never seen Mother Hildegard so passionate or vocal about anything as she was about ensuring people understood what had really happened at the convent. She seemed driven by a sense of moral duty to tell the truth, to counteract with her witness the lies that had done so much damage. She wrote letters to the American military authorities, trying to find information about the unit that had helped them, wanting to thank them formally and to ensure their kindness was officially recognized and recorded. The convent itself became a small center of a different kind of narrative about the war's end and occupation. People who came expecting to hear one kind of story found themselves confronted with another. The contrast between propaganda and reality was so stark and undeniable that it forced difficult conversations and uncomfortable realizations. Not everyone was willing to accept it. Some people clung to their prejudices despite evidence, unable to admit they had been wrong. But many others, confronted with direct testimony from respected religious women, began to question what they had been taught. Corporal Marcus Jenkins did survive the war. The 761st Tank Battalion continued fighting through the final weeks, participated in the occupation of Germany, and then gradually demobilized and shipped home. Marcus returned to Louisiana in late 1945, carrying with him Mother Hildegard's St. Christopher Medal, worn close to his heart, and vivid memories of a German convent where he had found unexpected grace and recognition of his humanity. He struggled, as did so many African-American veterans, with returning to a society in the American South that still denied him basic rights despite his military service and sacrifice. The contrast between being treated with dignity in defeated Germany and being treated as inferior in his own victorious country was painful and radicalizing. But he also carried with him a certainty, learned in that Bavarian village, that human connection could transcend even the most carefully constructed barriers, that genuine encounter between people could overcome propaganda and prejudice. Years later, in 1953, 8 years after the war ended, he received a letter that had somehow tracked him down through military records and veteran organizations. It was from Sister Agnes, written in careful English she had been studying and practicing, each word chosen with care. Mother Hildegard had passed away peacefully the previous year at age 65, but before her final illness and death, she had made Sister Agnes promise to try to find the soldiers who had changed everything for them that April morning in 1945. The letter, which Marcus kept and reread countless times over the years, until it was worn soft at the folds, described how Mother Hildegard had spent her final years speaking constantly about that encounter, how it had deepened and transformed her faith by stripping away the cultural prejudices that had limited and distorted it. She had insisted, Sister Agnes wrote, that the soldiers' act of kneeling in prayer in their chapel had been the most powerful sermon she had ever witnessed, one that taught her more about God's love and human dignity than decades of theological study and religious practice. Sister Agnes included in the envelope several photographs. One showed the convent as it looked in peacetime, its garden thriving with vegetables grown from seeds Private Wheeler had helped plant, the buildings restored and maintained. Another showed the current community of sisters standing together in the courtyard, and Sister Agnes had written on the back in careful English, "And we pray for you every day and remember your kindness always. You taught us what it means to truly see Christ in every person, without exception." Corporal Jenkins, who had become Mr. Jenkins and worked as a church deacon and community leader, carried that letter with him for the rest of his life. He showed it to his children as they grew up, and eventually to his grandchildren when they asked about his war service and what it had meant. It became a tangible reminder that even in the midst of humanity's darkest moments, even in the heart of a war built on ideologies of hatred and supremacy, individuals could choose connection over hatred, dignity over prejudice, faith over fear. His grandchildren would later say that he taught them more about human nature and faith through that letter and its story than through any sermon or lecture. Private Thomas Wheeler also survived and returned to his family farm in Pennsylvania, back to the rolling hills and fertile soil he had left years earlier. He planted the seeds Sister Agnes had given him, carefully nurturing them, and they thrived in the American soil, growing into plants that produced vegetables season after season. He saved seeds from those plants and shared them with neighbors, telling them the story of the German sisters who had been taught to fear him, but had learned instead to welcome him. His children grew up hearing that story, understanding from early childhood that the measure of a person had nothing to do with the color of their skin and everything to do with the content of their character and the kindness of their actions. Those seeds, both literal and metaphorical, spread through his community and shaped a generation's understanding. Sergeant James Washington made it home to Atlanta. Though he carried injuries both physical and psychological from his years of combat, shrapnel scars on his back and leg that ached in cold weather, memories and nightmares that would wake him in the dark hours, survivor's guilt about friends who hadn't made it home, he returned to his grandmother's church, the same African Methodist Episcopal church where he had been baptized as a child, and slowly found healing in the familiar rhythms of worship and community. He spoke rarely of the war, as many combat veterans did, the experiences too intense and complex to easily communicate to those who hadn't been there. But when he did speak about it, he always mentioned the convent in Cronac and the elderly Mother Superior who had opened a barricaded door despite her terror. He told his pastor, Reverend Thomas Johnson, about the moment he and his men had knelt in that chapel, how it had felt to pray in a space that represented everything they had been fighting for: the right to human dignity, the acknowledgement of shared humanity, the possibility of a world where people were judged by their character and not by arbitrary characteristics of birth. "We were fighting for the right to be seen as men, as fully human," he said during one conversation that the pastor later recorded in his journal. "And those sisters, once they got past their fear and propaganda, saw us exactly that way, saw us as children of God, same as them. That's what the war was supposed to be about, even if it didn't always work out that way." Lieutenant Robert Morrison had perhaps the most documented post-war life of any of the soldiers involved. He went on to have a career in the military that lasted until 1967, reaching the rank of colonel despite the systemic discrimination that made advancement difficult for African American officers, even after the military was officially desegregated in 1948. He wrote extensively in his personal memoirs, published privately for his family in 1972, about the Cronac incident and how it had reinforced his belief that education and personal encounter were the only real antidotes to prejudice. "We could have been bitter," he wrote in those memoirs. "Those women had been taught systematically for years to hate and fear us specifically. The propaganda about African American soldiers was particularly vicious and dehumanizing. But when confronted with reality instead of propaganda, when forced to actually encounter us as human beings rather than as propaganda images, they chose truth. They chose to see us as we actually were. That choice, repeated millions of times by individuals on both sides of every divide, is what slowly moves humanity forward. Not grand gestures or noble proclamations from leaders, but the daily decision by ordinary people to see the humanity in the other person, even when everything in your culture and upbringing tells you not to. That's how change actually happens. The village of Knelt itself went through the difficult and often painful process of reconstruction and political re-education that characterized all of Germany in the post-war years. The village had to confront what it had supported or tolerated, what it had believed or chosen to ignore. The convent remained throughout this period a quiet presence on its hillside, continuing its mission of prayer and service to the community. Over the decades, as memories faded and people passed away and new generations were born who had no direct experience of the war, the specific story of that April morning became less widely known in the immediate community, fading from collective memory the way most individual stories do. But within the convent itself, the story became part of the oral tradition passed carefully from one generation of sisters to the next. Novices entering the community, young women choosing religious life in a new era, were told about the day when terrified women barricaded themselves against American soldiers and discovered that their fear was based entirely on lies and propaganda. They were shown the chapel, where men they had been taught to despise as less than human had knelt in prayer identical to their own. They were taught that this moment represented the core truth of their faith, that God's love extended to all people equally, without exception or qualification, and that any faith that allowed for categories of lesser humanity was not true faith at all, but rather an accommodation to the prejudices of the world. Sister Therese, who had been the youngest sister in 1945, at only 25 years old, lived until 1997, dying at the age of 77. She had spent 52 years in the convent, watching the world change dramatically, seeing Germany rebuilt and the Cold War divide and then reunite the country. Until the very end of her life, when she was elderly and frail, she kept in her worn prayer book a faded wrapper from the chocolate bar Private Carter had given her for the children that morning. She would tell visitors that she kept it as a reminder that grace could come from the most unexpected sources, that God's love operated outside the narrow channels that human prejudice tried to impose upon it, and that the moment she saw those soldiers kneel in prayer was the moment she truly understood what Christianity meant. The historical significance of incidents like the one at St. Catherine's Convent extends far beyond the immediate participants and their individual transformations. They represent counter-narratives to the prevailing stories of hatred and division that dominated the war years, small moments of connection and mutual recognition that offered glimpses of a different possible future. In the larger narrative of World War II and its aftermath, these encounters between liberators and liberated, particularly when they crossed racial lines that societies on both sides insisted were absolute and unbridgeable divides, planted seeds of change that would grow in unexpected ways. The African American soldiers who served in Europe during World War II, approximately 1 million men, returned home to a country that still enforced strict racial segregation throughout much of the nation, that still denied them basic civil rights, including voting in many states, that still treated them systematically as second-class citizens despite their military service and sacrifice. But they returned with an expanded and reinforced understanding of their own dignity and humanity, confirmed by encounters like the one in Knelt. They had fought for freedom abroad, had been treated with respect and recognition in Europe, and they were increasingly unwilling to accept the denial of freedom and dignity at home. The civil rights movement that would transform America in the following decades was built in part by veterans who had learned, in places like a small Bavarian convent, what it felt like to be treated with full human dignity and who refused to accept anything less upon their return. The German civilians who experienced liberation by African American units faced their own reckoning with prejudice and propaganda. Those who were willing to acknowledge honestly the disconnect between what they had been taught and what they actually experienced became small voices for change in their own communities. The process of confronting and dismantling prejudice is never simple or complete or quick, spanning generations rather than days. But encounters like the one at St. Catherine's provided undeniable evidence, personal testimony that could not be dismissed as enemy propaganda, that much of what they had been taught was simply false. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.